The flight that changed everything. Ileana Carter stepped into the airport terminal, exhaustion tugging at her limbs. 7 months pregnant, she wasn't just carrying the weight of her unborn child. She carried the weight of expectations, assumptions, and the silent judgment that followed her wherever she went. She shifted her carry-on bag to her other hand and exhaled, willing herself to push forward. Just a flight, just a few hours, and I'll be home. Her husband, David Carter, had insisted on booking her a first-class ticket. He worried about her comfort, about her safety. It wasn't just any flight. It was Carter Aviation, the airline his family had built from the ground up. And while David didn't flaunt his wealth, he protected what was his, including Ileana. She wasn't one to make a fuss, but traveling while pregnant was an entirely new battle. Strangers either offered sympathy or shot judgmental stares, as if motherhood itself was a burden too heavy to carry in public. Still, she straightened her posture and walked with quiet confidence toward the first-class boarding gate. The gate agent, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and tired eyes, barely glanced at her ticket before nodding. "You're all set, Mrs. Carter. Let us know if you need any assistance." His voice was polite, if not a bit dismissive. She gave him a small smile, accustomed to the half-hearted courtesy given to those who looked like they didn't belong. She had long since learned that money didn't erase bias. It only disguised it in expensive suits and forced politeness. As she walked down the luxurious, carpeted jet bridge, she felt relief settle over her. Soon, she'd be seated in a wide, reclining chair with plenty of legroom. She imagined resting her swollen feet, maybe sipping on some sparkling water, and letting the hum of the plane lull her into a rare moment of peace. She barely noticed the flight attendant standing at the entrance of the first-class cabin until she spoke. "Miss, I think you're in the wrong section." The words weren't just wrong. They were sharp. Not a friendly, "Can I help you find your seat?" but a command, an accusation. Ileana paused, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. She turned her head slightly to meet the flight attendant's gaze. The woman's uniform was pristine, her blonde hair twisted into a tight bun, and her eyes cold with thinly veiled irritation. Her name tag read Vanessa Parker. Ileana kept her expression neutral, though she felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I have a first-class ticket," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Seat 2A." Vanessa's lips pressed together, her eyes flicking over Ileana's pregnant belly before she let out a slow, deliberate sigh. "First class is for premium passengers only," she said, her tone laced with disbelief. Ileana stiffened. There was something in her voice that made the air between them heavier. It wasn't just about a seat. It was about who she thought deserved to sit there. "Not you." The unspoken words hung between them. Passengers nearby shifted in their seats, some watching, some pretending not to. The unspoken rule of air travel. See something wrong? Stay silent. Ileana tilted her head slightly, refusing to shrink under Vanessa's scrutiny. "Would you like to check my ticket?" she asked, holding it up. Vanessa barely glanced at it before shoving it back into Ileana's hand. "Did someone buy it for you?" The question was asked with calculated condescension. Ileana exhaled slowly, pressing a protective hand over her belly. She had been through this before. The assumptions, the quietly weaponized politeness that wasn't polite at all. She could have told her then. She could have said, "My husband owns this airline." But that wasn't the point. She shouldn't have to say it. She forced her voice to remain calm, unwavering. "My husband booked it," she said, her gaze locking onto Vanessa's. A muscle in Vanessa's jaw twitched. She still wasn't convinced. "Ma'am," she said, her voice dropping lower, more forceful now, "I'll have to ask you to move to economy until I can verify your seating." Ileana stared at her, her heart pounding with a quiet but simmering anger. "No," she said simply. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The quiet rustle of passengers shifting in their seats, the soft ding of an overhead announcement. It all faded into the standoff between them. Vanessa's eyes darkened, her posture stiffening. "Ma'am, if you refuse to move, I will have to call security," she said, as if she were giving a final warning to an unruly passenger. Ileana didn't blink. Call whoever you need to. The words were not defiant, but they held power. Something flickered in Vanessa's eyes. An uncertainty, a hesitation. But it was brief. She squared her shoulders and leaned down slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper, but sharp as a blade. You don't belong in first class. The words struck harder than any slap could have. Ileana felt the sharp sting of injustice, of the silent biases she had spent her entire life pushing against. The cabin was silent, but the tension screamed. Then it happened. Before Ileana could process what was happening, before she could even react, Vanessa raised her hand and slapped her. The sound echoed through the cabin. Gasps filled the air. Passengers froze. A businessman in 3A adjusted his tie uncomfortably, as if trying to pretend he hadn't seen. A woman across the aisle, an older lady with kind eyes, whispered a stunned, "Oh my God." Ileana's head turned slightly from the impact, her cheek burning from the contact. For the first few seconds, she didn't react. She didn't speak. She didn't move. But something inside her clicked into place. Vanessa straightened her uniform, as if she hadn't just slapped a pregnant woman in front of the entire first-class cabin. "Now," she said, her voice tight with authority, "get out of this seat before I have you physically removed." A silence thicker than air settled over the cabin. Ileana's fingers trembled, but not from fear. She had been humiliated before, but this was different. She didn't argue. She didn't yell. Instead, she reached for her phone, her fingers moving quickly as she typed a message. "She slapped me." She hit send. Then she waited. A vibration against her leg. A single text from David. "What did you just say?" Ileana exhaled slowly. This was no longer in her hands. But Vanessa Parker had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The price of assumptions. Ileana's fingers tightened around her phone as the cabin remained eerily silent. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Her cheek still stung from the slap, but the pain was secondary now. Vanessa Parker stood above her, a forced expression of indifference, masking the crack of uncertainty in her gaze. She thought she had won, thought she had put Ileana in her place. But what she didn't realize was that the battle hadn't even begun. Ileana didn't look away as she typed out her response to David's text. "Flight 227. First class. She told me I don't belong here. Then she hit me." The read receipt appeared instantly. Then, 3 dots, moving aggressively as David typed back. "Stay in your seat. Do not move. I'll handle this." Ileana let out a slow breath, her heart steadying. She had nothing to fear. But Vanessa Parker did. The eyes of the cabin. Passengers in first class were watching everything unfold, some too stunned to react, others deliberately avoiding eye contact. Ileana noticed them. The older businessman in 3A who had shifted uncomfortably when Vanessa first confronted her, the flight attendants in the background whispering to each other, but too afraid to intervene, and the young couple in 1C and 1D wide-eyed with shock. They had all witnessed it, and not one of them had spoken up. The silence wasn't surprising, but it was disappointing. The woman across the aisle, a well-dressed lady in her 60s, finally leaned in. "Dear, are you all right?" Her voice was gentle, but the look in her eyes was something else. Fury. Ileana managed a small nod. "I'm fine." She wasn't, but she would be. The businessman in 3A cleared his throat awkwardly. "Bah, I think you should. I mean, someone should." He trailed off, clearly not willing to be the one to take action. Cowards. They were all cowards. The power shift. Vanessa Parker, oblivious to the storm she had just unleashed, straightened her posture. She still believed she was in control. Her expression hardened. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. Move to economy now, or I will have security remove you." Ileana tilted her head slightly. "Go ahead," she said calmly. Vanessa hesitated. The certainty she had displayed earlier was slipping, just a little. Before she could respond, the overhead intercom crackled to life. "Miss Parker, please report to the cockpit immediately." The entire cabin shifted. Passengers glanced around, sensing the sudden tension. Vanessa's posture stiffened. Ileana didn't need to look at her phone to know what had happened. David had made his first call. And Vanessa Parker's worst nightmare had just begun. Damage control. Vanessa turned, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she stormed toward the cockpit. The whispers followed her. The businessman in 3A muttered, "I knew something was off with her." The woman across the aisle pursed her lips. "She's about to lose her job." Ileana didn't react. She just waited. The cockpit door opened, and Vanessa disappeared inside. Inside the flight deck, Captain James Holloway sat with an unreadable expression, his fingers steepled under his chin. The co-pilot, flight crew supervisor, and 2 airline executives appeared on a video screen. The moment Vanessa stepped inside, the tone of the room shifted. "Miss Parker," the captain said, his voice dangerously calm, "do you want to explain why we just received a direct call from corporate headquarters regarding a physical assault in first class?" Vanessa froze. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Captain Holloway didn't wait for an answer. He tapped the screen, bringing up security footage from the cabin. A crystal-clear view of her slapping Ileana across the face. "You want to tell me how you thought this was okay?" Vanessa's stomach dropped. She had forgotten about the cameras. The final call. Ileana sat calmly in her seat, sipping the glass of water a different flight attendant had brought her. She knew what was happening in that cockpit. She knew Vanessa was trying to explain herself, trying to justify the unjustifiable. She also knew it wouldn't matter. A new message from David appeared on her screen. "Security will be waiting at the gate. She's done." Ileana smiled slightly. Justice wasn't always swift, but it was coming. Vanessa's walk of shame. The cockpit door swung open. Vanessa stepped out, her face pale, her hands clenched at her sides. Her gaze flickered toward Ileana. A mixture of anger, regret, and fear. The intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to an unfortunate personnel matter, one of our flight attendants will be disembarking upon landing. We apologize for any inconvenience and assure you that we take passenger safety and respect very seriously. Thank you for your patience." The entire cabin shifted. Passengers looked at Vanessa now, not with fear, but with something worse. Disdain. Vanessa took a single unsteady step forward. The older woman across the aisle leaned toward her and whispered, "I hope it was worth it." Ileana didn't say a word. She simply sat, composed, victorious. Vanessa walked past her toward the back of the plane, where she would sit in humiliated silence for the remainder of the flight. When the plane landed, security would be waiting. Her career was over. And she had no one to blame but herself. The unraveling begins. As the plane made its descent, Vanessa sat in the crew area, her hands trembling. Her mind raced. This was just a misunderstanding, right? Surely, she could explain. She had been a senior flight attendant for years. But no one had defended her. Not the passengers. Not her fellow crew members. Not the captain. And worst of all, she wasn't even sure if she believed herself anymore. For the first time, Vanessa Parker began to understand the full weight of what she had done. Not just to Ileana, but to every passenger she had ever dismissed, ignored, or mistreated. And she knew. This wasn't just one mistake. This was a pattern. And she was finally paying for it. Consequences in motion. The final descent of Flight 227 was quiet, unnaturally so. Passengers who had once been absorbed in their books, laptops, and in-flight entertainment were now sitting with anticipation, their eyes flicking between Ileana and the front of the plane where Vanessa Parker had disappeared. The world outside the window was a blur of city lights as the aircraft descended, but inside the cabin, the real turbulence was yet to come. Eliana sat unmoved, her hands resting lightly over her belly. The sting of the slap had faded, but the moment still lingered, playing over and over in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Even now, no one had spoken up in her defense. They had watched it happen, and they had done nothing. But that was fine, because David had spoken up. And now it was out of her hands. Vanessa's last moments in uniform. In the crew seating area, hidden behind a thin curtain at the front of the plane, Vanessa Parker sat rigid and silent, her fingers curled into her lap. She had spent the last 20 minutes reliving every second of her mistake, only now realizing just how deep the damage was. A direct call from corporate, a personal summons to the cockpit, a final warning from the captain. She wasn't walking away from this one. A lump formed in her throat as she heard the seatbelt sign ding off overhead. This is it. The moment the aircraft stopped taxiing, Vanessa felt her stomach clench. She had never dreaded landing before. Now, she wished the plane could just keep flying forever. Security at the gate. Eliana remained seated, as per David's instructions. Passengers in first class hesitated, uncertain if they should be the first to stand. Then, at the front of the plane, 3 uniformed security officers stepped on board. A ripple of whispers filled the air. They weren't here for a standard security issue. They were here for Vanessa Parker. The officers scanned the cabin briefly before one of them, a tall man with a clipped professional tone, spoke. "Miss Parker." A shuffling noise as Vanessa stepped out from behind the curtain. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, her hands gripping the edges of her uniform, as if she could hold onto her career through sheer force of will. A tense silence fell over the cabin. Passengers who had ignored the situation earlier were now fully invested, watching Vanessa the way one watches a train wreck, horrified but unable to look away. "You need to come with us," the officer said, his tone neutral but firm. Vanessa swallowed hard. I just need to explain." "Ma'am," the officer cut her off. "This isn't up for discussion." The color drained from her face. She turned her head slightly, as if searching for someone, anyone, who might come to her defense. No one spoke. No one moved. Not the passengers. Not the other flight attendants. Not even the captain. She was alone. The weight of her isolation hit her like a physical blow. She had spent years commanding authority, believing herself to be untouchable. And now she was being escorted off the plane like a criminal. A final look. As Vanessa walked down the aisle, flanked by security, she passed Eliana's seat. Eliana turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Vanessa paused for half a second, searching Eliana's face for something. Anger, satisfaction, maybe even pity. But there was none of that. Only calm certainty. And somehow, that was worse. The silence stretched between them for a moment before Eliana finally spoke, her voice low and measured. "I warned you." Vanessa flinched, but said nothing. Then she turned and walked off the plane. The viral storm. By the time Eliana stepped into the VIP terminal lounge, the story was already spreading like wildfire. A flight attendant. A first-class passenger. An unprovoked assault. Passengers had recorded the incident. Clips of Vanessa raising her hand had already been uploaded online, spreading across social media, news platforms, and corporate channels before the flight had even landed. David's legal team had already issued an official statement, making it clear that this wasn't just about one person. This was about systemic discrimination. Carter Aviation has a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct of any kind. The actions taken by our flight attendant do not reflect our values, and immediate disciplinary action has been taken. We will be conducting a full review of our diversity training and staff protocols to ensure this never happens again. Eliana scrolled through the headlines. Airline CEO's wife assaulted by flight attendant, caught on camera. Passenger mistreatment in first class. How discrimination still exists at 30,000 feet. Entitlement or enforcement when flight attendants overstep their authority. She sighed, setting her phone aside. She didn't need to read the comments. She already knew how the world would react. Some people would defend Vanessa, calling it a bad day or a misunderstanding. Others would use it as proof of the everyday discrimination that people like Ileana faced, even when they had every right to be where they were. But the truth was, Ileana didn't care about the debate. The only thing that mattered was that change was happening. And that was enough. Vanessa's last stand. Vanessa Parker sat in a stark white conference room at Carter Aviation headquarters, facing a panel of executives. She had been brought in for a disciplinary hearing, not because they were considering keeping her, but because they wanted to hear her out before making the inevitable decision. She sat rigid, her hands folded in her lap. The airline's chief operations officer, a severe-looking woman in her 50s, studied Vanessa for a long moment before speaking. "Do you understand the gravity of your actions?" Vanessa licked her lips. I was enforcing policy. She wasn't supposed to be in that seat. The executive raised an eyebrow. "Did you check her ticket?" Vanessa hesitated. The answer was no. Another executive leaned forward. "Did you think, even for a second, that you might be wrong?" Silence. Vanessa's fingers tightened in her lap. She could still fight this. She could try to argue. She could say she had been tired, overworked, under pressure. But the truth was on camera. The truth was already out there. And she was already finished. The fall of Vanessa Parker. Vanessa Parker sat in the sterile conference room of Carter Aviation headquarters, her pulse pounding in her ears. The harsh fluorescent lighting made everything feel colder, more clinical, as though she were an exhibit being examined rather than a person fighting for her career. But deep down, she knew this wasn't a fight. It was an execution. The panel of executives seated before her weren't here to discuss options. They weren't here to listen to her plead her case. They were here to bury her. At the head of the table sat David Carter, the owner of Carter Aviation, her former boss. His presence filled the room in a way that was suffocating. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't demanding justice in some dramatic way. No, he was staring at her, a silent executioner, watching her unravel. "Miss Parker," one of the executives began, adjusting his reading glasses, "you are aware of the formal charges being brought against you, correct?" Vanessa nodded stiffly, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had already read the report. Assault of a passenger, conduct unbecoming of a senior flight attendant, gross negligence, public relations liability. David Carter hadn't held back. He hadn't given her any room to negotiate, to save face. This wasn't damage control. This was destruction. "Before we proceed with termination," the executive continued, flipping through his documents, "we would like to hear your statement." Vanessa's fingers curled into her lap. She had practiced a dozen different defenses in her head, but none of them seemed to fit anymore. Her usual excuses, the ones she used to justify treating passengers like inconveniences rather than people, suddenly felt hollow. She had built her entire career on authority, on control, on enforcing the rules with an iron grip. She had prided herself on keeping the first-class cabin exclusive, on weeding out those who didn't belong. But now she was the one being removed. Her breath hitched, and for the first time, she truly understood the irony of it all. She had stripped Ileana of her dignity in front of a cabin full of people, and now she was sitting here completely stripped of her own power, her own career. She had done this to herself. Still, pride was a parasite. It clung to her, whispering that she could still fight this. She straightened her shoulders. David Carter raised a hand, silencing her. His voice was smooth, cold, absolute. "Miss Parker, you are not here to argue your case." Her mouth snapped shut. The weight of finality in his tone settled over her like a noose. A public execution. Vanessa sat paralyzed as another executive, one she had never met before today, began reading aloud the official statement of her termination. "Due to your egregious misconduct and the overwhelming evidence provided, Carter Aviation officially terminates your employment, effective immediately. In addition to this, a formal complaint has been filed with the Federal Aviation Authority, and we will be recommending that your flight attendant certification be revoked indefinitely. Vanessa stiffened. This was worse than just losing her job. This was worse than just getting fired. They were making sure she would never work in the airline industry again. She had spent 10 years climbing the ranks, building a reputation as one of the strictest and most disciplined flight attendants in the industry. And now, in a matter of hours, it was all gone. No second chances, no appeals, no way back. The weight of the world. The words rang in her head, each one striking deeper than the last. Employment, effective immediately. FAA complaint filed. Permanent industry blacklisting recommended. She had spent her entire career controlling people. Now she had no control over anything. Her vision blurred for a second as reality came crashing down on her. For the first time, she wasn't the one calling the shots. For the first time, she was the one being told to leave. A final plea. Vanessa knew she shouldn't speak. But pride wouldn't let her leave without one final attempt. She turned to David Carter, her voice wavering, but still trying to maintain her usual authority. "Mr. Carter, please. I've given this airline 10 years of my life. I was enforcing policy." David didn't react, not even a blink. "You weren't enforcing policy," he said flatly. "You were enforcing your own bias." The words hit harder than any reprimand ever had. Before she could muster another defense, David leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "Let me make this clear, Miss Parker." Her stomach tightened. "You put your hands on my wife. In any other circumstance, I would have made sure you were arrested the second your feet hit the ground." Her breath caught. "I am choosing to let you walk away without criminal charges," he continued. "But don't mistake that for mercy. You will never work in this industry again." Vanessa's throat tightened. She wanted to fight back, to argue, to scream that this was unfair, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. She had destroyed herself. She had looked at Ileana and assumed she didn't belong. She had thought herself untouchable. And now, she was untouchable in an entirely different way. The walk of shame. The meeting ended. Just like that. No further discussion. No room for debate. No hope for reconsideration. A security guard stood at the door, waiting for her to get up. The moment she did, it felt like she was walking her own funeral procession. As she stepped out into the hallway, she caught sight of a TV screen playing the news. Her own name flashed across the screen. Breaking. Carter Aviation flight attendant terminated after assaulting passenger. Public outrage over discriminatory treatment of first-class passenger. Vanessa Parker, senior flight attendant, officially fired following viral incident. Her face, once a symbol of authority, was now a public disgrace. She turned away from the screen, pushing through the doors into the parking lot. She was jobless. She was blacklisted. She was officially ruined. And worst of all, she had no one to blame but herself. The fall of Vanessa Parker. The weight of exile. Vanessa Parker had always believed herself to be untouchable. She had climbed the ranks, weathered complaints, enforced policies with unapologetic authority. And in doing so, she had convinced herself that she was the law on any plane she stepped onto. But now, as she stood in the cold, empty parking lot of Carter Aviation headquarters, she wasn't untouchable anymore. She was a cautionary tale. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone. She needed someone, anyone, to tell her that this wasn't as bad as it seemed. She dialed the one person who had always backed her up, the only friend she had left in the industry, Michael Lawson, a senior flight supervisor at another airline. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Then his voice, clipped and hesitant. "Vanessa." She swallowed. "Michael, you saw it, didn't you?" A pause. Everyone saw. Her stomach twisted. Everyone. Michael, listen. This was blown out of proportion. It was just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. He cut her off, his voice sharp. Vanessa, I watched the video. I saw you slap her. She closed her eyes, her grip tightening around the phone. I didn't mean to. You put your hands on a pregnant woman. Silence. Michael exhaled. Do you have any idea how bad this is? Airlines are already scrambling to distance themselves from you. You're trending on every social media platform. Customers are calling for an industry-wide ban. She felt her knees buckle. Michael's voice lowered, but it wasn't with sympathy. It was with finality. You're finished, Vanessa. She felt her breath hitch. But we've worked together for years. I helped you win. Vanessa, he interrupted, his voice frigid. I can't be associated with you. Nobody can. And then, before she could beg, before she could say anything that might salvage whatever was left, he hung up. The call ended with a hollow beep, leaving Vanessa standing alone in the dark, her career in ruins at her feet, a name that no longer held power. She stumbled to her car, barely able to process what had just happened. For years, her name had commanded respect in the airline industry. Now, it was radioactive. She tried to imagine herself starting over, working for a smaller airline, a private jet company, anywhere that would take her. But she already knew the truth. She had spent years being feared, not respected. And now, when she needed help, there was no one left willing to stand beside her. Her phone buzzed again. Her heart leaped for a second. Maybe someone was reaching out to support her. Maybe Michael had changed his mind. Then she saw the notification. Breaking news. Former Carter Aviation flight attendant denied employment across multiple airlines. Her chest tightened as she read the article. Multiple airlines, including her former employer's biggest competitors, had issued official statements distancing themselves from her. Vanessa Parker wasn't just fired. She was blacklisted. Permanently. Her head dropped against the steering wheel, her breathing unsteady. What have I done? The internet's verdict. She had always known social media was ruthless, but nothing could have prepared her for this. Her name was on every major news platform. Her face was plastered across every social media feed. People had clipped the video from the flight and analyzed her every move. I bet this isn't the first time she's done something like this. Just the first time she got caught. She didn't even check the ticket first. She just saw a black woman sitting in first class and assumed she didn't belong. The fact that she slapped her without hesitation says everything. This is why implicit bias training needs to be mandatory. People like her think they're just following policy, but their policies always target the same kind of people. I feel zero sympathy. She built her career on power tripping. Now she's powerless. The worst part? They weren't wrong. For years, she had justified her strictness as discipline, her control as necessary order. But maybe she had been blind to the damage she had done. Maybe Ileana wasn't the first person she had humiliated, just the first person powerful enough to fight back. And now the world was watching her fall. And they weren't looking away. Vanessa's choice. She had two options now. She could fight back, double down, and claim that this was all blown out of proportion. She could finally do what she had never done before. Accept responsibility. She sat there in the silence, staring at the notification still glowing on her screen. A new email. Subject: accountability. Her pulse jumped. It was from David Carter. She hesitated before opening it, knowing that whatever it said, it would be the final blow. The last warning. The email was short, brutally so. Miss Parker, I imagine by now you've seen the consequences of your actions. I won't waste time repeating what's already been made clear. However, you still have a choice. You can walk away from this situation with nothing but regret, or you can acknowledge that this isn't just about you. If you are truly willing to take responsibility, not just for what happened to my wife, but for the years of unchecked behavior that led to this moment, You may contact my office. But understand this. I'm not interested in whether or not you're sorry. I'm interested in whether or not you change. The choice is yours. David Carter. Vanessa stared at the screen. This wasn't a lifeline. It wasn't forgiveness. It was an ultimatum. A chance to face the truth. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to argue. She wanted to defend herself. But something stopped her. For the first time, she realized. She didn't have a defense. She had judged Ileana before even looking at her ticket. She had abused her authority. She had humiliated someone who had done nothing wrong. And now, she was finally facing the consequences. A slow, shuddering breath escaped her lips. She clicked reply. And for the first time in her life, she typed the words, "I was wrong, and I am ready to change." With a final breath, she hit send. Then she sat back and waited for the next chapter of her life to begin. Redemption or ruin. Vanessa Parker sat in her darkened apartment, staring at the email she had just sent to David Carter. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the walls settling. Her world had stopped moving, but outside, it kept turning. She had been fired. She had been blacklisted. She had become the most hated flight attendant in the country. Now, for the first time in her life, she had to ask herself, who am I without this job? The email she had just sent sat there, mocking her. I was wrong, and I am ready to change. The words felt foreign on her screen. For 10 years, she had never apologized to a passenger. She had never admitted fault. She had always been in control. Now she was learning what it felt like to have no power at all. Her phone buzzed. Her breath caught. For a second, she thought, maybe it's David Carter. Maybe it's an answer. But it wasn't. It was a news notification. EXCLUSIV. Vanessa Parker speaks out following Carter aviation scandal. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't spoken to the media. So then, who had? The court of public opinion. She clicked the article, her stomach twisting as she read. Sources close to Vanessa Parker state that she has expressed no regret over the incident and believes she was unfairly terminated. According to these sources, Parker plans to appeal her dismissal and pursue legal action against Carter Aviation for wrongful termination. Vanessa froze. Who said that? She wasn't planning an appeal. She wasn't suing the airline. This was a lie. But the internet didn't care about the truth. Her name was already being dragged even further. She's really trying to play the victim here. Of course she's not sorry. She got caught and now she's trying to save herself. She should be banned from every airline. No second chances. Typical. She didn't think she did anything wrong, even when she put her hands on a pregnant woman. Her hands shook as she read the comments. She wasn't just hated. She was becoming a symbol of everything wrong with airline discrimination. If she had any hope of redemption, it was slipping away by the second. She needed to fix this. Now. Damage control. Vanessa grabbed her phone and dialed the only person who might know where this lie came from, Michael Lawson. After 3 rings, he picked up. Vanessa, I told you not to call me. I need to know something. Her voice was sharp, desperate. Did you talk to the media about me? Michael exhaled, irritated. No, Vanessa. Nobody wants to talk about you, except for the entire country, and not in a good way. She clenched her jaw. Then where is this coming from? The media is saying I'm fighting my termination, that I'm trying to sue Carter Aviation. Michael went silent for a second. Then he sighed heavily. It's your union rep. They're trying to fight for your job, whether you want them to or not. Her stomach dropped. She had forgotten about them. The flight attendant union had been notified when she was fired, and they had a history of protecting employees, even when they were in the wrong. She had never asked for their help, but they were fighting anyway. And in doing so, they were making her look even worse. Her chest tightened. The one thing she had left, her attempt to take responsibility, was being buried under even more bad press. She needed to act. Now, the public statement. Vanessa knew she had two choices. She could let the narrative spiral out of control, or she could face the public head-on. For the first time, she had to admit her mistakes, not just privately, but publicly. She opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, with a deep breath, she began to type. Official statement from Vanessa Parker. I want to make something very clear. I am not appealing my termination from Carter Aviation. I do not believe I was unfairly dismissed. I do not believe I was just enforcing policy. The truth is simple. I made a terrible mistake. I let my bias cloud my judgment. I assumed something about a passenger that I had no right to assume. And when confronted, I reacted in a way that was completely unacceptable. For years, I have prided myself on being in control, on maintaining order in the first-class cabin. But in doing so, I failed to see the people behind the seats. I thought I was enforcing the rules. But the truth is, I was enforcing my own assumptions, and that is not something I can justify. I am not asking for sympathy. I am not asking for my job back. I am simply stating what should have been said from the start. I was wrong. I am sorry, and I will do better. Vanessa stared at the screen. Her entire body felt tense, her hands still trembling. She hesitated for a moment. Then she hit post. There. It was done. Now, all she could do was wait. The aftermath. It didn't take long for the internet to react. Within minutes, her post was everywhere. Well, at least she admitted it. That's more than most people in her position ever do. Is she sorry, or is she just sorry she got caught? I'll believe she's changed when I see her do something to fix it. This is the first flight attendant I've ever seen actually admit they were wrong. Maybe there's hope. It's not just about her. It's about the entire industry. Airlines need to start fixing this system-wide. Some people were still furious. Some doubted her sincerity. But some were willing to listen. And for Vanessa Parker, that was the first step. She wasn't looking for redemption. She wasn't trying to erase what she had done. She was just trying to be better. And for the first time in her life. She wasn't doing it for control. She wasn't doing it for power. She wasn't even doing it to fix her career. She was doing it because she knew she needed to change. And that was something she had never done before. The road to redemption. Vanessa Parker had spent the last 48 hours drowning in the consequences of her actions. She had been fired, blacklisted, and publicly shamed. She had watched her career crumble in real time. She had seen her face plastered across news headlines, her name turned into a cautionary tale. And now she was staring at the response to her public statement, scrolling through thousands of comments, each one a different shade of judgment. Some people were furious, unwilling to accept her apology. Some were skeptical, questioning whether she was only apologizing because she had no other choice. And some were willing to see if she could change. But Vanessa knew words wouldn't be enough. If she wanted redemption, she had to prove it. The question was, how? A call she never expected. Her phone buzzed, breaking her out of her thoughts. She hesitated before answering. "This is Vanessa." A calm but firm voice responded. "Miss Parker, this is Lisa Crawford. I run the Passenger Rights Advocacy Network." Vanessa's stomach dropped. She had heard of Lisa Crawford. She was a fierce advocate for airline passengers who had been discriminated against, mistreated, or denied fair treatment. She had personally fought against airlines that had failed to address bias and misconduct. And now, she was calling Vanessa. "I saw your public statement," Lisa said, her tone unreadable. It was interesting. Vanessa exhaled slowly, trying to control the nervous tension in her chest. "I meant every word." A pause. "That remains to be seen," Lisa replied. "I don't believe in cancel culture, Miss Parker. I believe in accountability. And right now, you have a unique opportunity." Vanessa straightened in her seat. What kind of opportunity? Lisa's voice sharpened. To do more than just say sorry. To actually help change the industry you were once part of. Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. She had expected to be ridiculed, ignored, or dismissed. She hadn't expected someone like Lisa to offer her a way forward. Keep talking, Vanessa said quietly. An unexpected offer. Lisa didn't waste time. I spent years working with flight attendants and airline executives to create better passenger policies. But the truth is, no matter how many reports we publish, airlines don't listen until the problem goes viral. Your case has the world's attention right now. Vanessa's pulse quickened. So what do you want from me? Lisa's answer was immediate. I want you to use your experience to help us expose systemic discrimination in the airline industry. I want you to help us train flight crews to recognize their biases before they turn into another viral incident like yours. Vanessa froze. She had expected Lisa to demand a bigger apology, a donation, a statement in support of her organization, something that could be done in an afternoon and forgotten by the next day. She hadn't expected her to ask Vanessa to become part of the solution, to actively help fix the problem she had been part of. Why me? Vanessa asked, skepticism creeping into her voice. Lisa sighed. Because you're the perfect example of why this keeps happening. You didn't think you were racist. You didn't think you were discriminating against passengers. You thought you were enforcing policy. And yet, you saw a black woman in first class and assumed she didn't belong. That's the kind of unconscious bias that happens every single day in the airline industry. Vanessa swallowed hard. Lisa was right. She had never considered herself a bad person. She had never thought of herself as discriminatory. And yet, she had humiliated a pregnant woman on an international flight. And the only reason she was being held accountable was because Ileana Carter had the power to fight back. She had assumed her own authority was absolute. She had assumed her decisions were always justified. She had assumed Ileana was in the wrong without even checking. Now those assumptions had destroyed her career. And Lisa was offering her a way to make things right, not just for herself, but for the industry. The first step toward change. Vanessa's fingers tightened around her phone. What would that even look like? She asked cautiously. Lisa was ready. You would speak at our next airline bias seminar, alongside former passengers who have faced discrimination. Vanessa inhaled sharply. You want me to stand in front of a room full of people and tell them what I did? Yes. Vanessa's stomach twisted. She had spent her entire career commanding authority. Now Lisa wanted her to stand up and admit that she had abused that authority. The thought made her skin crawl. But then she remembered Ileana's face when she told her, "You don't belong here." She remembered the sting in her palm after she struck her. She remembered what it felt like to be escorted off that flight in front of a full cabin of passengers. And she knew she had to do this. If she wanted to prove she had changed, she had to do the one thing that scared her the most. She had to face what she had done. The seminar. 1 week later, Vanessa stood in a conference room filled with airline employees, executives, and industry professionals. She gripped the edges of the podium, her chest tight with nerves. Beside her, Lisa Crawford stood with her arms crossed, watching her carefully. The audience was silent, expectant. Then, Vanessa took a deep breath and spoke. I used to believe I was the perfect flight attendant. I followed every rule, enforced every policy, and made sure my cabin ran exactly how I wanted it to. I thought I was fair. I thought I was just. I thought I was in control. She swallowed, forcing herself to continue. But the truth is, I wasn't any of those things, because when Ileana Carter sat in first class, I didn't see a passenger. I saw someone I thought didn't belong. And instead of checking my assumptions, I humiliated her. A murmur rippled through the room. Lisa nodded slightly, urging her forward. Vanessa's voice tightened, but she didn't stop. I lost everything because of that moment. My job, my career, my reputation. And for the first time in my life, I had to ask myself, was I really enforcing policy? Or was I enforcing a bias I refused to acknowledge? Silence. Vanessa took a deep, shaky breath. The truth is, this wasn't just one mistake. It was a pattern. And it wasn't just me. This happens every day in the airline industry. Passengers are judged based on how they look before their tickets are even checked. And until we start recognizing it, we will keep making the same mistakes. The audience was silent, absorbing her words. Then a single clap. Then another. And another. Until the entire room was applauding. Not because she had been forgiven, but because she had finally faced the truth. And for Vanessa Parker, that was the first step toward becoming something she had never been before: better.